Every morning, right before sunrise, we'd pass mile marker 47, and every morning, without fail, the engineer would pull the brake. No platform, no passengers. Just a field of yellow grass and a rusted signpost with half the letters gone, but he'd stop. Anyway, let the engine sigh, then wait exactly 3 minutes. Passengers used to whisper about it. Some joked, others complained. "Old man's losing it," they'd say. Can't tell a station from a scarecrow anymore, but I was the conductor, and I'd been watching him long enough to know better. His name was Walter Grady, though most folks just called him Walt the Quiet. He'd been driving trains since before the war, back when locomotives had more smoke than shine. He wasn't the kind to talk, but he was the kind who noticed things. Like when a loose bolt rattled under the floorboards, or when the rails bent just enough to hum a different tune. And when we stopped at that nowhere place, he always looked the same way, not out at the horizon, not at the signal lights, but slightly down, as if expecting someone standing just off the tracks. The first time I asked about it was a cold November morning. The windows fogged so thick the passengers could have been ghosts. We pulled up to mile 47, the brake hissed, the steel groaned, and Walt leaned forward with that slow, deliberate calm of his. "Everything all right?" I asked. He didn't answer. Just lifted his gloved hand and tapped the clock above the controls. 7:12 a.m. Right on time. Then he said, almost to himself, "He'll be late today. He'll be late." No name, no explanation. Just that, when the whistle blew again, we rolled on. I didn't ask twice. You learn not to pry into a man's ghosts, especially the ones that make him gentle. Weeks passed. Seasons turned. I learned Walt's patterns like I learned the rhythm of the rails. He'd hum old war songs under his breath when he thought no one could hear. He kept a folded photograph tucked inside his vest pocket, edges worn, corners creased soft by years of handling. Once, when he thought I wasn't looking, he took it out during the stop. Held it in the pale dawn light. Then put it away as soon as the clock struck 7:15. Whatever he was waiting for, it was personal. Sacred even, and though the timetable said the stretch between mile 47 and the next junction was non-stop, he made it a stop anyway. We called it the station with no name. By spring, word had spread. People started asking to ride his train, just to see the mystery stop for themselves. There were theories. Some said he'd lost someone there during the war. Others swore a little boy used to wave to him from that very spot every morning, back when the old depot still stood. But the depot was gone long before my time. Torn down after the tracks were rerouted. Now, only a few concrete blocks and wildflowers marked where the platform had been. And still, Walt stopped. 3 minutes. No more, no less. He checked the clock, listened to the hum of the engine, then nod once like a man acknowledging something unseen, and pull forward again. One evening after shift, I finally asked our yard chief about it. "Why does he stop there? There's nothing out that way." The old man behind the desk smiled, not the kind of smile you give when something is funny, but the kind you give when something hurts too much to forget. "There used to be something," he said. Then looked past me, out the window, toward the westbound tracks glowing in the sunset. "What?" I asked. He took a breath, slow and deep, and said, "Someone." That was all. After that night, I started watching the stop differently. Not as a delay, but as a ritual. He'd ease the train to a halt, hands steady on the throttle, eyes fixed on that empty field. Sometimes, I'd swear I saw movement, just a trick of light, maybe. The way wind bends the tall grass. But I'd catch my breath anyway. And when we left, I always looked back through the window. And there, every time, the morning fog would rise, curling into the faint outline of what could have been a small figure near the signpost. Maybe it was nothing. Maybe it was just my mind learning the same pattern his had. But one thing I knew for sure, he wasn't crazy. He was remembering. And when a man remembers that hard, sometimes even a train has to stop. That summer, management announced Walt's retirement, 43 years on the rails, his final run scheduled for early September. He didn't seem surprised. He just nodded and said, Then I'll make my last stop count. Nobody knew what he meant, but somehow we all felt it. Mile 47 would matter more than ever. The story came to me like most truths do, quiet, uninvited, and late at night. It was 2 weeks before Walt's retirement run. I was in the crew lounge, patching my jacket, when the yard chief wandered in with a stack of yellowed ledgers under his arm. He set them down, poured himself a cup of burnt coffee, and said, "You ever look inside these?" I shook my head. "They're old manifests. Back when the station at mile 47 still existed." He thumbed through one and stopped on a page marked 1951. "See here," he said, tapping a faded note. "Special stop requested. Passenger name Vel Turner. Age 12. Destination Eastwood Orphan Home." I stared at the paper. 12, he nodded. Kid had no ticket, no parents, just a tag around his neck. The station master wrote that Walt himself paid his fare. I didn't know what to say. He smiled faintly. That was the first time they met. Walt was younger then, but already quiet. Folks say the boy used to come every morning, waiting by the fence. Waving at every train that passed. Walt took notice. Brought him a sandwich once. Then another. Before long, the boy was part of the morning like the whistle or the smell of coal. The chief closed the ledger. They say Walt promised him something before the boy left that last time. "When you're grown," he told him, "I'll stop here for you. Even if the station's gone." He took a sip of coffee and shrugged. Maybe that's all there is to it. But I could see something else in his eyes, that flicker of respect men reserve for promises kept against the weight of time. The next morning, I couldn't stop thinking about it. When we reached mile 47, the fog was thick enough to blur the horizon into white. Walt eased the brake, and the world went still, just the slow hiss of the engine cooling. He looked out the window, same as always. But this time, I saw his reflection in the glass, not the stoic man behind the levers, but a face lined with memory. I found myself asking, quietly, what was his name. He didn't look at me. Just kept his eyes on the field. "Leo," he said. Then, almost as if correcting himself, "No, I called him that." His name was Leonard, but he liked Leo better. He smiled, faintly. "Smart kid. Used to fix my lamp when it burned out. Said he was gonna build his own engine one day." He reached into his vest and took out the worn photograph I'd seen before. It was small, almost colorless, but I could make out two figures, a young boy grinning beside an old locomotive, a man standing just behind him with his cap tilted low. "That's him," Walt said. "Last picture before the war ended." I wanted to ask more, but something in his tone told me not to. He folded the photo back into his pocket, checked his watch, and pulled the throttle. We rolled forward, leaving the empty field behind once more, though that morning it didn't feel empty at all. A few days later, I went digging. The library kept old railway bulletins and local newspapers. I found one, dated October 12, 1951, headline, "Child Missing After Evacuation Train Mix-Up." I read every line. The boy had been sent west during an emergency relocation. His group was separated at the junction near Greenville. Most made it to safety. He didn't. No follow-up. No remains. Just a note, presumed lost during transit. The article mentioned one thing that stuck with me. He was last seen near mile 47, waiting by the tracks. I stared at that line until the ink swam. That night, I told Walt what I'd found. He listened, silent, eyes on the dark window. The reflection of the cabin lights shimmered on the glass, making it look like he was staring into another world. Finally, he said, "I know." He took a breath, slow and steady. "I came back from leave that week. Heard the story from the new station man. I went looking, walked the rails for miles. Found his cap near the bend. That's all." He turned slightly toward me. The next morning, I stopped the train. And I've been stopping ever since. After that, we didn't talk about it again. We didn't have to. The stop at mile 47 became heavier somehow, not strange or superstitious, but sacred. Passengers still whispered, but their voices softened now, as if they could sense that something unseen shared the moment with us. Sometimes, on clear mornings, I thought I heard it too, the faint echo of a child's laugh carried on the wind, the kind you almost recognize but can't quite place. Walt would glance up then, eyes shining in that half-light, and say, "He's still here, you know." Never missed a morning, and I believed him. Because when a man keeps a promise that long, the world tends to keep it with him. By late August, the railway announced his final run. The schedule showed our departure at 6:35 and arrival at 9:10, no mention of a stop at mile 47. But everyone knew it was there, unspoken, the last enlisted station, the one that didn't exist on paper, but lived in the heart of a man who refused to pass by what memory told him to honor. And when that day came, the whistle would sound not for passengers or towns, but for a promise that had outlived time itself. September crept in quietly that year. The mornings carried that certain kind of chill, the kind that reminds you things are ending, even if no one says it aloud. Walt's retirement was set for the 12th. The timetable still had his name printed beside train 402, though most of us knew it by another name, the morning line. He arrived early on his final week, hat brushed, boots polished, same old pocket watch ticking faithfully against his chest. You could tell he was trying to treat it like any other day. But there was something softer in the way he moved, something that told me he already knew he was saying goodbye not just to the rails, but to the part of himself that had lived between them. On the morning of his last run, the depot was unusually crowded. Engineers from other routes, conductors, even the station master himself, they'd all come to see him off. It wasn't an official ceremony, but you could feel the weight of respect in the air. When Walt stepped up into the cab, a few men saluted without saying a word. He just nodded once, as if to say, "Thank you, but I'm not done yet." I climbed aboard right after him. He gave me a look of the kind that said, "You ready?" And I was. At 6:35 sharp, we pulled out, the whistle cut through the cool morning air, and the engine rumbled beneath us. Alive and strong, the rails sang that familiar steel song, part rhythm, part memory. No one in the crew spoke much. Even the passengers seemed quieter than usual, their voices hushed by something they didn't quite understand. We passed mile 20, then 30, then 40. I kept glancing at the clock, 7 to 10. 2 minutes to go. When the marker appeared through the haze, that bent signpost at mile 47, I felt my chest tighten. Walt's hands never trembled, not once in all the years I'd known him. But as he reached for the brake, I saw his fingers pause, just a fraction of a second longer than usual. Then he pulled it. The wheels screamed softly against the track, slowing to that perfect crawl he'd mastered long ago. The train stopped, just as it always had, right on the invisible line where a station used to be. Steam hissed. The engine sighed. He looked out the window. And for a moment, it was as if the years folded in on themselves, the past and present touching hands through the glass. I followed his gaze. The field was the same as ever, yellow grass, rusted posts, a sky too pale for morning, but something about the air felt different. He leaned forward, slightly, whispering something I couldn't catch. Then, without warning, he did something he'd never done before. He opened the window. The wind rushed in, carrying the scent of rain-soaked earth. Walt took off his cap, pressed it to his chest, and said, quietly, "You kept me waiting long enough, kid." I froze. And then I saw it. A flash, just a shimmer of white near the edge of the grass. Maybe a trick of the light, maybe not. But for an instant, I could swear I saw the outline of a boy, small, waving, just like in the stories. The breath caught in my throat. Walt's eyes glistened. He smiled. Not the tired smile of an old man, but the one of someone who's finally home. We waited our 3 minutes, though they felt longer. That day, when the watch hit 7:15, he nodded once, as if to someone outside, then eased the throttle forward. As the train pulled away, I glanced back one last time. The morning fog was rising again, swallowing the tracks behind us. But through it, I saw a figure standing near the signpost, still waving. Then it was gone. The rest of the ride was quiet. No one spoke. The passengers looked out their windows in silence, as if they too had seen something they couldn't quite explain. When we finally reached the terminal, Walt shut down the engine, climbed down the steps, and stood beside the locomotive for a long while. I walked up beside him. "Was he there?" I asked. Softly. He didn't answer at first. Then he said, "He always was." He handed me his pocket watch, the same one he'd carried for decades. "Keep it running," he said. "Trains don't wait for people. But sometimes they should." Then he patted the engine twice, like saying goodbye to an old friend, and walked toward the depot. I never saw him again. A month later, I took his route. First run as engineer. Same train, same tracks. And when we reached mile 47, I slowed down. Not much, just enough for the wheels to sing that soft note he loved so much. I looked out the window. The field was empty, the morning still. But I swear I heard something faint, distant, a whistle, not from our engine, but from the past. It echoed once, long and low, and I smiled. Because I knew that somewhere, beyond what I can see, the promise still lived, and the train that waited was never really gone. It's been 30 years since that morning at mile 47. Trains don't breathe the way they used to. They hum. They glide. They don't sigh or wait. And yet, every time I ride the morning line, I can still feel him there, Walt. The man who stopped for a boy that the world had already forgotten. They tore down the old tracks a few years after his retirement. Progress, they called it. Steel replaced by concrete, signals by satellites. But the field remained. I drove out there once. Back when my own hands were still steady enough to hold the wheel. The air was thick with the smell of summer rain, and the grass whispered against my boots as I walked to the place where the signpost used to be. No marker, no trace, and just silence. I stood there for a long time, wondering if promises fade when the world changes, or if they sink deeper, like roots, waiting for someone to remember. And as I stood, I heard it, faint but clear, the rhythm of iron wheels on faraway rails. It came from nowhere. A ghost sound, maybe. Or maybe just memory learning to speak again. The years rolled on. Most of the men from those days have passed now. The depot's gone too, turned into a parking lot. But the stories, they find their way back. They always do. A few months ago, a young journalist came to see me. When I told her about Walt and the boy, she leaned forward, eyes wide. "Was any of it ever proven?" she asked. I smiled. "Doesn't matter if it was." She frowned a little. "Then why keep stopping all those years?" I thought about it. Then said, "Because some promises aren't made to be broken or proven. They're made to be remembered." She was quiet for a moment, then asked if I still had his watch. I reached into my coat pocket and set it on the table. Same nickel finish, a little dull now with age, but still ticking. Always ticking. She picked it up gently. "You ever wind it?" "Every morning," I said. "At 7:12. She looked confused. "Why that time?" "Because that's when the train stopped," I said softly. "And because some mornings deserve to start with a pause." Last week, I went back again. The field's smaller now, hemmed in by power lines and a new road that cuts across where the rails once ran. But as the sun rose, I could almost see it, the faint shimmer of steam, the curve of a locomotive easing to a stop, the tall silhouette of a man in a cap, standing by the window. I closed my eyes and listened. The air was still. The world felt far away. Then I heard a sound, a single, distant whistle, long and low. It was the same note I'd heard years ago. The same that used to echo through my bones when Walt leaned on that horn and smiled like a man speaking to the sky. And though I knew it couldn't be real, I raised my hand and waved just in case someone, somewhere, could still see me. I never told anyone this before, but I think about Leo sometimes, the boy. I wonder if, somehow, he ever knew. If he saw that train stop for him, even once, and smiled. Maybe that's why I keep winding the watch. Because time has a way of circling back to the moments that matter. And maybe, just maybe, a promise like Walt's never really ends. It just changes hands from one soul to another, from one story to the next. When I got home that day, I set the watch on my nightstand. It was still ticking, still faithful. I closed my eyes, and for a moment, I was young again, leaning out of the engine window, the wind in my face, the sun spilling across the rails. Somewhere ahead, a figure stood by the tracks, small, waiting. And beside me, a voice I hadn't heard in decades said quietly, "He's right on time." The whistle blew. And just like that, the train began to move, slow at first, then steady, then endless. Sometimes I think heaven isn't a place. It's a moment. The one you keep waiting for until the end, and when it finally arrives, you recognize it. For me, it's a field of yellow grass, a rusted signpost, and a promise kept. And every morning, at 7:12, the train still waits. If this story stayed with you even for a moment, then you understand what Back When Stories is all about. Here, every tale is more than words. It's a memory, one that still echoes through time. We tell the stories our grandparents used to whisper, the ones that remind us of who we were, and what we still hold dear. If you felt something, nostalgia, warmth, maybe even a tear, then join us, subscribe, leave a like, and share this story with someone who remembers, because every click, every comment, every new listener keeps these memories alive, and somewhere out there between the rails, the rain, and the radio static, another story is waiting to be told. Don't miss it.